Hi everyone, this is Phil Travis, and this week's presentation is on the Cold War. Particularly in the late 40s. The Cold War, in this presentation is going to come largely from the American perspective, but it should be noted the Cold War really fundamentally shapes Europe for decades to come. Indeed, today, Europe is still shaped by many of the really, foremost decisions and changes that were brought about by the Cold War. Of course, to this day, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, remains the bulwark of European security. And this, of course, was created by the United States in the late 40s in the context of the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, was a global standoff between the two most powerful superpowers, the United States and its allies in Western Europe and across the developing world, and of course the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe and also across the developing world. The United States, an empire driven by capitalist democracy, and the Soviet Union, an empire driven by communism. So the Cold War, though, was very fundamental to the map of Europe. Of course, a divided Germany, a divided Berlin. Of course, the Cold War very much influenced Eastern European states on a very fundamental level, not only East Germany, but of course also Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so forth. The Cold War, of course, also shapes Western Europe. The United States, of course, establishes military bases. Of course, so does the Soviet Union, but the United States establishes military bases across Western Europe, in England, in Germany, in Italy. The United States stations nuclear weapons across these areas, as does the Soviet Union. And this week, we're going to look at the Cold War in the late 40s, and we're going to see how really key events, both within Europe and in the sort of broader, shall we say, European orbit. So we're also going to look at the cases of like Turkey and Iran, because they're very relevant to the beginning of the Cold War in 1946. But we're going to look at how events in the late 40s, really crystallized the Cold War and created this standoff between these two global powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. A standoff that really lasts for upwards of over 4 decades, from the late 40s until 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed following the reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev. And of course, during this time period, the Cold War often took the world to the brink of war. And across the developing world, of course, the Cold War resulted in a myriad of conflicts across the developing world, some very, very destructive, like the Korean War, which began in 1950, and then, of course, the Vietnam War, and then, of course, other, maybe less intense and less well-known conflicts that were fought across the developing world. But this week, we're going to look at the Cold War in the late 40s. In particular, we're going to look at U.S. policy and how U.S. policy sort of shapes the development of post-war Europe in the aftermath of World War II.
So something I wanted I'll go ahead and put these up. Something I wanted to remind everyone from our discussion last week or from our lecture last week is the importance of leadership in decisions that were made at the outset of the Cold War. Now, when we say this, I'm not trying to say that if there had been a different leader, it necessarily would have been different. We can't know that, of course. But what we can know is that the decisions made by the leaders who were in charge at the time were very significant to the outset of the Cold War. And these decisions by folks like Truman and Stalin were to a large degree influenced by World War II, or particularly the period before the outset of hostilities of World War II. The so-called Lessons of Munich, the Munich Conference, of course, in 1938, when the Allies appeased Hitler and gave to him the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. This became, the symbol of appeasement. And after this, both the United States as well as Stalin, of course, also Britain, are deeply influenced by what this lesson meant for future foreign relations. For the United States, you don't appease aggressor. You don't appease a dictator that potentially could be more offensive, and that lesson has applied to the thinking of some foreign policy specialists well into the future, including applications with respect to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, as well as even with respect to the issues in the Crimea and the Ukraine more recently. And of course, the question with this interpretation, by the way, is when is this actually an applicable way of looking at a historical situation? So anytime that one applies the lessons of Munich becoming very aggressive against a power that might be perceived as an offensive power, when is the comparison to the rise of Nazi Germany and the Blitzkrieg of Europe? When is it applicable? When is it not? Likewise, Stalin's viewpoint, World War II was only further confirmation in his view that the capitalist West sought to destroy the Soviet Union. Stalin associated Hitler's Germany, while it was fascist, he associated it more broadly with anti-communist intentions of the West. And so the Soviet Union under Stalin very much sought to construct a buffer zone to protect the Soviet communist world from what it saw as the designs of the West. And likewise, the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, became very proactive in their prevention of Soviet advances in any areas of the world. The Cold War, in some respects, maybe in terms of rhetoric, should be tracked to the beginning of 1946 with the dual declarations of the Cold War. First, February 9th, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union declares that Marxist-Leninist ideals are valid for the unevenness of development of the capitalist countries. And the West understood this a little bit differently. To the West, that statement was like a declaration of war. It was like saying that the Soviet Union must expand. It's not clear that that's exactly what Stalin meant, but that's how it was received in the West. And likewise, on March 5th, of course, while in Missouri, Winston Churchill, of course, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, stating that an Iron Curtain has descended and that God has willed the atomic bomb for the United States. So these were important rhetorical points for the emergence of the Cold War, but I think the first two most important actual events occurred in Iran and Turkey. So Iran was a key issue during World War II. Iran had been, effectively a part of the British Empire, and the British oil interests were highly invested in Iran. And during World War II, there were different, kind of ideas for dealing with Iran. Some suggested dividing Iran. By 1944, there was a decision made amongst the Allies that Iran would be free, but the Soviets and British would share the oil. And this was kind of the issue. Is the interest in Iran, of course, was respect to, the resources there, and the Soviet Union very much wanted a piece of this. In early 1946, the United States and the British renege on that agreement, the agreement to allow the Soviets access to Iranian oil. And this becomes a bit of a trend in the early Cold War as the Allies are increasingly suspicious, increasingly concerned about a possible expansive threat from the Soviet Union. As a result of changing course in 1946, the Soviets inspired a revolt in Azerbaijan, which is today a small independent country just to the north of Iran. And the Soviets inspired a revolt in Azerbaijan, and they positioned their military there. And this created tremendous concern for the Allies and the United States, leading our Secretary of State, James Burns, at the time, to claim that the Soviet Union was on the move everywhere. There was a lot of concerns that there could be an actual engagement between the forces of the Soviet Union and those of the West in Iran. Ultimately, the Iranian leaders made a deal with the Soviets about oil access, but the United States kind of double-crossed Stalin in this case, and once the Soviet military was out of Azerbaijan, effectively the Iranian government backed out on the agreement, and increasingly the United States tried to encourage Iran leaning towards the Western sphere of influence. And of course, this will come to fruition perhaps most during the Eisenhower administration, when the socialist-leaning leader Mossadegh was overthrown in a coup supported by the CIA and the British special agents MI6, and therein installing the Shah of Iran. The Shah became a Western-leaning kind of hardline leader, and it was in the context of that leader that the sort of more radical, more Islamist leadership that you have in Iran today emerged. It's a very important long-term historical lesson about this period of the origin of the Cold War. Turkey, there was an issue with the British allowing access to the Dardanelles, basically the areas through the Bosphorus Straits where the Black Sea enters into the Mediterranean. The Soviet Union very much was interested in having open access to this because the Soviet Union lacked a warm water port, and the Black Sea was almost that. But the issue, of course, was a concern over expansion of Soviet influence within the Mediterranean. These events, the events in Azerbaijan, revolts in Greece, issues in Turkey, and what's seen as a Soviet intent to spread their influence lead to the emergence of something called the domino theory. And the domino theory, as I'll go ahead and show you the kind of 1980 Cold War map again to give you a feeling for what we're talking about. The domino theory is really the formal idea that the United States will use to justify military, monetary, various forms of commitment throughout the developing world during the Cold War, and Europe, actually, not just the developing world. In fact, the domino theory really was first most applicable to a concern in Europe. And the idea behind the domino theory was that the United States had to contribute internationally in a way that it had not before. The United States had to be militarily involved in a way that it had not before, because if we didn't stop communism in a particular place, like Vietnam by the late 1950s, like Greece or Turkey, or even Iran, but particularly Greece and Turkey in 1946, that if we didn't do that, that communism would spread at an accelerated pace, and the United States would be increasingly unable to prevent a large-scale expansion of communism. Of course, ultimately, one of the big questions we ask is, does the USSR really represent the same threat as Hitler in 1938? Were the lessons of Munich really applicable here? And most scholars and some specialists at the time, like George Kennan, for example, the founder of the containment policy, were really not convinced that the Soviet Union represented the same threat as Hitler. Stalin was opportunistic, exploiting weak points where they existed. And so American strategists like George Kennan will devise a strategy to contain the Soviet Union by drawing a resistance in certain areas that the Soviet Union wishes to expand in and contain them. And the idea was that you could contain them, they wouldn't seek all-out total war, and you could contain them and then ultimately negotiate with them. That was the original idea behind the containment policy, though it changes in not too long, and George Kennan will resign because of it. You also have to remember, before I flip the slide here, the Soviet Union is utterly decimated. The Soviet Union lost upwards of 20 to 25 million people in World War II. Their country is very much ravaged. So the idea that they even possess that kind of capability is in itself, quite dubious. Another major issue, of course, was the issue of atomic weaponry. And of course, the United States possessed a nuclear monopoly in the immediate post-war period. In March 1946, Dean Acheson, the Acheson-Lilienthal Plan, proposed a plan to move these weapons into control by the United Nations. The Truman administration appointed Bernard Baruch to the UN to head the Atomic Energy Commission. And again, I say, leadership matters because Baruch was really, kind of a hardliner with respect to the United States position on this. And of course, the Truman administration will support this position. But Baruch wanted an all or nothing agreement, and he wanted the United States to be able to dictate the grounds. And it was a position that ultimately was unacceptable to the Soviets. Now, the Soviets refused to accept inspections into the Soviet Union. That was what ultimately was the number one factor for them. And the Soviets, of course, claimed that they wanted the immediate destruction of the weapons and an international agreement against their development and use. The Soviets suggested that they wanted these turned over into an international agency. However, we have to remember that very little is really known or understood about Stalin in the West at this time. We still have a limited understanding of Stalin. And so there was a lot of suspicion about what Stalin's intentions were. And I think in a lot of cases, one would have to say that those intentions were not entirely unfounded. And there was already distrust between the United States and the Soviet Union during not just because of the ideological reasons of communism, but of course during World War II, the United States openly shared information about its nuclear program with the British and withheld it from the Soviets. And Stalin, of course, found out through his espionage channels. But it's very difficult for the United States to give up this weapon because there was a fear in the Truman administration that if you did this, you gave up the technological advantage in warfare, the greatest technological advantage ever, that the Soviets could turn around and develop their own, and then you would be at a disadvantage. And so the Truman administration was really pressured to not allow that to happen to them. And so the United States will hold on to the atomic monopoly. And this is very significant, of course, because this leads ultimately to a nuclear arms race. Because the Soviet Union will increasingly seek to construct its own weapons of this kind, which it will do, influenced to a significant degree by espionage. And these events very much enhance the Cold War. Even though atomic weapons were not always perceived by all of the people who asked to hold on to them, who thought we should hold on to them, they were not always perceived as an all or nothing thing. George Kennan, for example, believed that the United States should have a small arsenal of small atomic bombs that could be used, that were enough to provide a deterrent for containment of communism, and if used, could be used in relatively small scale, almost tactical ways, whereas the position the United States took and the Soviet Union took was really to advance the mass production of bigger and bigger and more advanced atomic and then thermonuclear weapons, which creates a situation where effectively at the height of the Cold War, there was a risk that the United States and the Soviet Union could completely annihilate humanity from the earth. Today, of course, nuclear proliferation remains a huge issue. There's great concerns over an Iranian nuclear program. Israel possesses nuclear weapons, but it's undeclared. But it's widely accepted as fact that the Israelis tested a nuclear weapon in the late 70s down in the South Atlantic. Of course, Pakistan, India, North Korea, as well as the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, possess these weapons. And these weapons in the world today remains one of the most concerning issues in foreign policy. And was it inevitable? Individuals like George Kennan tried to take actions to prevent it. And most historians suggest that history is not an inevitability. but there were very difficult decisions made at the time. Another very difficult situation that, again, and I kind of mentioned this in the previous lecture, but that, again, just is a very difficult situation, was the situation of Germany, because originally there was a real push for Germany to be reunited as one country. But there were such disagreements on what the future course for Germany should be that the Western powers left their troops largely in Germany, established bases in Germany, and the Soviet Union remained in Eastern Germany. And of course, Berlin became an island within Eastern Germany that was itself divided between West and East. And of course, in the beginning of John F. Kennedy's administration, Nikita Khrushchev will, of course, begin the construction of the Berlin Wall. Ultimately, the United States didn't feel it could get out of West Germany unless the Soviet Union got out of West Germany and ultimately changed its tune with respect to its vision for Germany. The United States insisted we wanted a unified, democratic, and a Western-friendly Germany. And likewise, the Soviet Union wanted a Germany that was like a satellite state that would be used to provide reparations and rebuild the Soviet Union. George Kennan, as I mentioned earlier, is the father of the containment policy, and he was known as Mr. X because he wrote a document relating to the Soviet military power. He was stationed in the USSR. He was a specialist on Soviet foreign policy, and he wrote this. He wrote this secret, if you will, memorandum in 1947 that outlined the containment policy, the containment doctrine. The containment policy, it changes. Initially, George Kennan influenced containment policy is really only the dominant sort of force in the Truman administration during the late 40s. And even then, the Truman administration is going against certain aspects of George Kennan's ideas of containment. For example, George Kennan did not like the purposeful, exaggerated fear tactics that were used in the Truman Doctrine speech. He thought that the United States intentionally created a heightened concern over Soviet communism, and that in doing so sort of helped to facilitate a policy that was increasing the likelihood that there would be a permanent bipolarity, a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. George Kennan, what he believed in was that you contained communism in certain strong points. You would use a counterforce to prevent Soviet military gains in certain critical areas, strong points. It was an asymmetrical type of approach. So he doesn't think you have to contain communism everywhere all the time, but he thinks, in Iran it's probably a good idea. In Greece it's probably a good idea. And his idea was that the Soviet Union wasn't like Hitler, that the Soviet Union was relatively weak, and they were going to seek to exert force and expand influence in certain specific critical strong points, places that have oil, for example, places that have access to, a warm water port. And so he felt you just had to contain the Soviet Union, and eventually you would contain them long enough where they would just simply cease the saber rattling, and they would be ready to discuss, to have normal conversations and diplomacy, and to enter the Western world, sort of with the rest of the world. That was his idea. He didn't believe that we should promote containment for the sake of the overthrow of the Soviet Union. Though that wasn't necessarily something that he was necessarily, opposed to. Like he certainly would have preferred a democratic Soviet Union, I think, or Russia, I think. But his policy was not a policy to promote the collapse of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, that's how containment policy will develop. It will become a global policy that is based on the idea of proxy wars, sometimes indirect wars, military buildup, military preparedness, ultimately until one or the other collapses. And that was kind of the course that the Soviet Union, or the containment policy took, though it was not necessarily the way that containment policy inherently had to be. We'll talk a little bit more about that next week as I talk about the 50s and also the Cold War associated with the 50s. For George Kennan, Europe was the central factor, and the end game was really creating an environment for negotiations and normalization with the Soviet Union.
The Cold War resulted, after 1946, resulted in a really fundamental transformation in the U.S. national security apparatus. Here pictured, you see President Harry Truman signing the National Security Act of 1947. And the National Security Act is absolutely fundamental for not only the coming decade, but also for really the structure of the national security state in the United States and its influence in the world until present day. We have to remember, as we look at this, you have to remember that the United States' involvement as a global international power with a large standing army and with a robust international security service is a new thing. Before World War II, the United States really did not have a large peacetime standing army. Instead, the United States would prepare for war when war came, and then it would return to its rather small, relatively insignificant army after the war. Indeed, after World War II, the United States, it should be noted, did not plan to stay in Europe. The United States, after the war was over, more or less intended to, in the short term, really return back home and go back to sort of business as usual. But the demands, because of a completely destroyed Europe, and the demands for security, particularly against the concerns over an expanded communist threat, meant that the United States really felt it had a real responsibility to stay in Europe, to assist in the rebuilding of Europe, and to help act as a bulwark against the expansion of Soviet communism. So the National Security Act, signed in 1947, establishes the Pentagon, the Defense Department. It establishes the Central Intelligence Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so the unification of the heads of all the branches of the American military, if you will. The National Security Council, which is the council that advises the president on matters of national security, which of course is absolutely fundamental to U.S. policymaking. And of course also the United States resumed the draft, and the draft continued to be used during the 1950s, and of course it will be ramped up during the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, in a highly controversial way. During the late 40s, some really major things changed that, in a lot of respects, made the Cold War sort of what it was. It led to the crystallization, intensification of the Cold War. The 1949 collapse of the forces in China to the forces of Mao Zedong, and Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang are defeated and pushed off mainland China to their island of Taiwan, which of course the United States recognized the island of Taiwan as the government of China well into the 1970s, and of course still to this day the Chinese government, which is a communist government, still considers Taiwan to be rightfully a part of China and not an independent country. In 1948, there is of course a blockade of Berlin, the city of Berlin, by Joseph Stalin, and the United States, the former Allies, the British, conduct the famous Berlin airlift to break this blockade, a blockade that really did take the world to the brink of war. It should be noted that in the 1940s, the United States believed that the next great war would happen in Europe, and the United States really retooled its military to deal with a major world war in a European theater rather than the sort of brushfire developing world wars that it would fight. Of course, the Soviet atomic bomb, 1949. See in this image here below, we have a picture of one of the atomic bomb tests. The Soviet atomic bomb, which of course was in part a product of espionage. Here you see pictured Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, two individuals that were rather controversial, convicted for espionage, and of course put to death. The execution of Ethel Rosenberg was, of course, particularly controversial in the early 1950s. But the development of the Soviet atomic weapons technology will again increase the likelihood of a major arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, and help to lead to a really intense Red Scare in the United States, a tremendous paranoia in the domestic world in the United States over communism and espionage. And of course, as a result of these things, the United States forms NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, on April 4th, 1949. And this was remains to this day, an alliance system designed to provide unified security and protection against a potential attack from the east, or from anywhere for that matter, but particularly during this time, an attack from the east. And NATO countries, built security forces, contributed, as did the United States, as we do still to this day, as does the European powers still to this day, contribute to the NATO defensive forces. And of course, the Soviet Union responded in kind with what was called the Warsaw Pact, which was very similar to NATO. Now, of course, the Warsaw Pact ceased to be along with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But of course, NATO has very much expanded and remains a vehicle for the defense of the security of Europe. And today, of course, NATO is fundamental to the defense of many countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, like, for example, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So here you see pictured Germany after the collapse. You see Germany divided into the four major sectors: the United States in orange, the French in the blue, the British in the green, and of course the Soviets in the red. And you see, of course, Berlin in the heart of East Germany, divided similarly, with the Allies in the west and the Soviets in the east. Now, after World War II, the Allies could not agree on what to do with Germany. Particularly the Soviet Union and the Western powers disagreed. The Soviet Union wanted a demilitarized, neutral Germany, but only after Germany had delivered the required reparations to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was very interested in having a sort of buffer zone to its empire in Europe, and it also very much wanted to sap reparations out of Germany to rebuild the Soviet Union. In contrast, the Allies and the United States believed fundamentally that Germany needed to be sort of rebuilt and brought back to economic capacity. It needed to have its industrial capabilities restored so that it could play a fundamental role in the economics of a rebuilding Western Europe. And of course, the Allies took steps towards this direction. And the Soviet Union, of course, unable to accept this. The United States and the Allies unable to accept the Soviet approach on this. And so both sides basically prepared to accept a division of Germany. Well, East Germany, with Berlin at its heart, also a divided city, was a city that the Allies had accepted an agreement that railroad routes and roads into the city would be protected, and the Allies would be able to remain in the city and access it. Stalin, naturally feeling that his policy is falling apart, seeks to push the Allies out of Berlin. And by doing this, Stalin basically cuts the western routes into the city. He blockades the city. And his whole idea here was that he could prevent the Allies from supporting the city and the city would basically be returned totally to a Soviet-dominated Eastern Bloc. Truman, however, drew a hard line here, and a major reason for this, for drawing a hard line, is the fear of losing ground to the Soviets, and of course the increasing fear potentially of a domino theory. The United States, too, we were not in a great, if I may use we, the United States, the Allies, were not in a great military system. They had been reducing the size of their military, and they're relatively outnumbered by the Soviets at this time. And this led to the conversations in the United States over the usage of atomic weapons. The United States is the only country with atomic weapons and the only country with a plane capable of delivering atomic weapons. It must be noted that Berlin was not a place of strategic importance, as General Lucius Clay noted. It was not a huge strategic area. It was a psychological one. And this is like at the core of what becomes known as the domino theory, the idea that you have to fight and stand up to communism in places that might be strategically unimportant because of the psychological blow that a loss to communism might cause. And so it was really a psychological issue. And so over the period from June 24th, 1948 until May 1949, the Allies, holding strong to keeping West Berlin a free zone, began airlifting supplies into Berlin. And of course, these supplies, many of them were flown, not all of them, but many of them were flown on B-29s, the very plane capable of dropping an atomic bomb. And in the United States, there was a very important decision made over the control of atomic weapons. There was a moment where the military asked for atomic weapons to be, the right to use atomic weapons in a case of war, to be turned over to military control, i.e. that the military could use this weapon the way they would use any other weapon and at their whim, rather than, of course, the way that it is now with the reality being that only the president can authorize the usage of, is the final authority in the operational use of atomic or nuclear weapons. And Truman adamantly refused that, fearing that you'd have some brash military leader that might seek to use atomic weapons, whether or not it was the right decision. And of course, these were these new, horrifyingly destructive weapons that, of course, could spark off a very major conflagration. And so, as a result of that, we see the power to use the atomic weapons, the ultimate authority over atomic weapons, vested in the president as opposed to the military as a result of this crisis. This was a crisis that very much, for a period of time, took the world to the brink of war. And there was great concern that there could be another war with the Soviet Union over Berlin, which, again, for Lucius Clay, the Allied general, Berlin was not a strategically important place, but it was an invaluable psychological place, and a place that the United States and the Allies' defense of in the Berlin airlift, the breaking of the blockade, was very much about the domino theory and the psychological impact of this operation. And of course, ultimately, the U.S. and combined Allied operation breaks the blockade. It's an embarrassing blow to policies of Joseph Stalin. And ultimately, of course, a little bit more than a decade later, we'll see the premier Nikita Khrushchev begin the construction of the Berlin Wall, which goes up largely to prevent intellectuals from the East going to the Western sectors, as well as issues with espionage and also political issues for the Soviet Union. Its inability to have Berlin, the entirety of Berlin, become part of the East German sector and have to deal with this sort of Western island right in the heart of an important aspect of the Eastern Bloc. And so the Allies do break the blockade. And you see here, of course, you see a picture of some of the planes being being loaded with supplies to be flown into to West Berlin. Of course, I also wanted to show you a map of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which I already mentioned. And of course, this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as it exists today, including countries like the Baltic states, of course, as I mentioned, Poland, Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. Of course, in recent years, the issue with Ukraine, the controversy over Ukraine and Russia, has to a large degree been the issue of Ukraine by at least some of the Western leading elements in Ukraine, suggesting that they would seek admittance to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This, of course, was a security alliance of Western-friendly nations, allies of the United States. It was to act as a security, a defensive network against the forces of communism. And, of course, it's expanded greatly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization provides security by the positioning of troops, bases, in some cases through the United States, nuclear weapons around the perimeter of the Soviet Union, which was, of course, the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War. And this, of course, was a highly significant development, and one that, of course, led the Soviet Union to create the Warsaw Pact, and in a lot of respects sort of crystallized the standoff of the Soviet Union by sort of formalizing the development of military alliances that were pitted against one another in the heart of Central Europe. Of course, done for an issue of security, but also, of course, embodies really a formalization of Cold War realities, shall we say.